The neon sign of the roadside diner flickered in the cold night air, buzzing faintly as moths danced around its dim glow. Inside, the smell of burnt coffee and grease filled the air, mingling with the low murmur of conversations and the occasional clatter of plates from the kitchen. Frank Mitchell, a 57-year-old retired Marine sniper, pushed his mop across the black and white checkered floor. He had been working this job for nearly a year now, quiet, unnoticed, just how he liked it. After years of war, he wasn't looking for recognition or trouble, just the simple routine of cleaning up after other people's messes. Frank wasn't built like the younger men he used to train. He had gray creeping into his hair, a weathered face, and a slight limp from an old injury that never healed quite right. To most people, he was just another quiet, broken-down old man, barely making ends meet. And that was fine with him, until tonight. The roar of engines shattered the diner's peaceful lull, followed by the screech of tires as a pack of bikers pulled into the lot. The diner's regulars glanced up, their conversations pausing as 6 men, loud, aggressive, and reeking of whiskey, pushed through the glass door. Frank barely looked up. He had seen their kind before, men who had never fought for anything real, but strutted like they owned the world. The leader, Troy, was a broad-shouldered thug with a thick beard and cold eyes. His second-in-command, Deke, had tattoos covering his arms, his presence screaming of someone who liked breaking things. The others, laughing hyenas following their leaders, looking for an easy target to pick apart. Tonight, that target was Frank. The harassment begins. Frank was mopping near the counter when the first beer bottle hit the floor, shattering just inches from his foot. The entire diner fell silent. The bikers howled with laughter, watching him, waiting for a reaction. Frank exhaled slowly, gripping the mop tighter. He had seen this kind of thing before: provocation, escalation, violence. He had survived it in war zones. He could survive it here. But the bikers weren't done. "Hey, old man, you missed a spot." Frank ignored them, bending down to pick up the shattered glass. "What's wrong, Grandpa? Can't hear us?" This time, Deke kicked over the mop bucket, spilling dirty water across the tiles. The diners watched in silence, waiting to see how Frank would react. But he didn't react. He simply grabbed another mop and kept cleaning, and that infuriated them. Troy got up from his booth, swaggering over with his beer still in hand. He loomed over Frank, a smirk on his face, blocking his path. Frank looked up, meeting his eyes without a hint of fear. "You too proud to say something, old man?" Troy sneered. "Or are you just another useless sack of—" He shoved Frank's shoulder, hard. The diner gasped. The waitress at the counter froze, her eyes darting between Frank and the bikers. The cook in the kitchen peeked out from behind the pass-through window, his knuckles white on the edge of the counter. Frank steadied himself, setting the mop aside. He could feel it coming. The instincts he had buried for years were now bubbling to the surface. The precise calculations of distance, movement, and exits that had once kept him alive. He knew how to end this fight before it even began. But he gave them one last chance. "You don't want to do this, kid." His voice was calm, steady, emotionless. Troy grinned, leaning closer. "Oh yeah? And why the hell not?" Frank tilted his head, measuring Troy's posture, his stance, sloppy, overconfident, predictable. A mistake. For the first time, Frank spoke without restraint. "Because if you push me one more time, I'll make sure you never push anyone again." The room went ice cold. A challenge had been issued. Troy's cocky smirk faltered for just a second, but then he shoved Frank again. That was it. The sniper inside Frank came alive. With one lightning-fast movement, Frank grabbed the edge of a metal tray from the counter, and in less than a second, slammed it into Troy's ribs with brutal precision. The air left Troy's lungs in a gasp. The bikers jumped to their feet, shocked. They never expected the quiet janitor to move like that. But Frank wasn't done. Before Troy could react, Frank hooked his foot behind Troy's knee and yanked, sending the biker crashing to the ground with a painful grunt. The diner erupted in chaos. One of the bikers, Deke, lunged toward Frank. "Big mistake!" Frank sidestepped, grabbing a coffee pot from the counter, and hurled boiling hot coffee straight into Deke's face. Deke screamed, stumbling backward, clutching his scalded skin. The rest of the bikers froze. Frank turned, his calm, deadly eyes sweeping the room. "Still think I'm just an old janitor?" The silence was deafening. No one laughed anymore. The bikers, humiliated and seething, realized, too late, that they had picked the wrong man. Frank took a deep breath, rolling his shoulders. The fight wasn't over yet. The remaining bikers exchanged uneasy glances. Would they attack, or would they finally realize who they were dealing with? One thing was certain. If they made another move, Frank wouldn't hold back. The silence that followed was thick enough to choke on. The bikers, once so loud, so sure of themselves, now stood frozen in place. Their leader was on the floor, wheezing, struggling to catch his breath. Another was screaming, clutching his scalded face from the coffee Frank had just thrown. And Frank? He stood there, his grip tightening around the metal tray in his hand, breathing steady, gaze sharp, like he was back in a war zone, assessing his targets. Because that's exactly what they were now, targets. The few customers who hadn't already scrambled out of the diner sat in stunned silence, too afraid to move. Even the waitress behind the counter looked like she was holding her breath. Frank had given these punks a chance to walk away, but they had pushed him. Now, they were about to learn exactly who they had messed with. Deke, the one still clawing at his burning face, roared in pain and fury, wiping the steaming liquid from his eyes. His skin was red and blistering, but he didn't care. "You son of a..." he growled, lunging at Frank. Frank didn't hesitate. He stepped forward and planted his elbow straight into Deke's throat. Not too hard, but just enough to make him gag and stumble back. Before Deke could recover, Frank grabbed him by the collar and slammed his forehead straight into Deke's nose. A sickening crunch. Deke collapsed onto the table, blood pouring from his face. Another biker, Mitch, charged in next, fist raised, ready to land a heavy punch. But Frank had seen this move 100 times before. Predictable, slow, sloppy. Frank sidestepped at the last second, causing Mitch to stumble past him. And that's when Frank struck. With precision and force, he swung the metal tray like a hammer, cracking it against the side of Mitch's skull. Mitch crumpled like a sack of bricks. The diner gasped as he hit the floor, unconscious before he even landed. 3 bikers down in less than 10 seconds. The last 2 froze, suddenly realizing they weren't dealing with an ordinary old man. Troy, still on the ground, gasped for air, his ego just as bruised as his ribs. He glared up at Frank, hatred burning in his eyes. "Who the hell are you?" he rasped. Frank rolled his shoulders, loosening the tension in his muscles. He didn't smile, he didn't gloat. He just let the moment settle. Then, finally, he spoke. "I'm just a janitor." Troy gritted his teeth, seething. "Bullshit!" Frank stared down at him, unblinking. "I was a Marine sniper, served 15 years overseas, 2 tours in Iraq, 1 in Afghanistan." Troy's face drained of color. "I've taken down threats from half a mile away. I've been hunted in jungles, deserts, and mountains, and I survived every single time." He leaned down, inches from Troy's face. "You? You're just a punk who thinks wearing a leather jacket makes you tough." Troy swallowed hard. He was scared now, really scared. His hands trembled as he tried to push himself up, but his ribs protested in agony. Frank straightened up and turned his gaze to the remaining bikers. "Pick up your trash and get out. Now." No one moved for a long moment. Then, finally, one of the uninjured bikers rushed forward, grabbing Mitch and slinging him over his shoulder. Another grabbed Deke, who was still groaning, blood running from his nose. Troy, the leader, glared one last time at Frank. Frank raised a single brow, daring him to try something. Troy dropped his gaze. He had been defeated. Without another word, the gang stumbled out of the diner, humiliated, broken, beaten. Their boots scraped against the tile floor, their departure eerily quiet compared to the way they had arrived. The door swung shut behind them. The diner was silent. Then, the waitress exhaled sharply, as if she had been holding her breath for the past 10 minutes. "Jesus Christ, Frank!" Frank sighed, rolling his neck, his body still humming with old instincts that hadn't seen action in a long time. "Sorry about the mess." The other customers stared at Frank like he was some kind of legend. The manager, a stocky man in his 50s, hurried out from the back, taking in the unconscious bodies, overturned chairs, and scattered trays. "Frank? What the hell just happened?" Frank wiped a bit of sweat from his brow. "Mop bucket spilled, got a little carried away." The waitress snorted. "A little? The manager let out a breath, shaking his head. Then, to everyone's surprise, he clapped Frank on the back and laughed. "Well, I've been wanting those bastards gone for a long time. Consider this your Employee of the Month bonus." A ripple of laughter spread through the diner. Frank didn't need thanks, didn't need applause. But as he turned back to finish mopping, a warm feeling settled in his chest. For the first time in a long time, he didn't feel invisible.